This is the story of how a simple unemployment pattern predicted every single American recession for 70 years before anyone bothered to write it down. The pattern works like this. When the unemployment rate rises by just half a percentage point, a recession follows, not sometimes, but every time across 11 recessions since 1950. And yet this pattern, visible in the most watched economic statistic in the world and published monthly for economists to analyze, went completely unformalized until 2019. Claudia Sahm, the economist who finally codified this rule, didn't even do it to predict recessions, but rather to trigger automatic stimulus checks. What became known as the Sahm Rule represents one of the most remarkable cases of collective oversight in modern economics. Not because the data was hidden in some obscure corner, but because thousands of economists analyzed unemployment data in every Federal Reserve meeting and somehow just missed it. They noticed it, mentioned it in meetings, wrote about it in footnotes, but nobody turned it into something you could actually use until the pattern had already worked perfectly for 7 decades. The Sahm Rule triggers when the 3-month moving average of the national unemployment rate rises 0.5 percentage points or more above the lowest 3-month average from the previous 12 months. And that's it. One number with one threshold, not a complex econometric model with 15 variables or a sophisticated algorithm analyzing multiple data streams, just a simple question: has unemployment risen by half a percentage point from its recent low? If the answer is yes, you're in a recession or about to be. Measuring change rather than level means the rule works whether unemployment starts at 3% or 6%. Automatically adjusting for shifts in what economists call the natural rate of unemployment. During the 1980s, when normal unemployment ran higher, the rule still worked, and in the 2010s, when unemployment hit historic lows, it still worked. The track record speaks for itself. July 1953, recession saw the Sahm Rule reading hit 0.63 just 4 months after the downturn started, while August 1957 brought a reading of 0.502 months in. December 1969 produced 0.773 months into the recession. And the pattern continues through every single downturn without exception. November 1973, during the oil shock recession, brought 0.60. January 1980's brief recession before the big one triggered at 0.53, and July 1981, when unemployment eventually hit 10.8%, showed 0.60. The savings and loan crisis in July 1990 registered 0.53. The dot-com bust in March 2001 hit exactly 0.50, and December 2007, at the start of the Great Recession, came in at 0.53. February 2020 during the COVID recession was different, hitting 4.00 as an instantaneous collapse from an external shock rather than the usual slow-motion train wreck. But even there, the rule triggered within 2 months. 11 recessions, 11 triggers, 0 misses, with an average lag of approximately 3 months between recession start and the Sahm Rule triggering. Compare that to the National Bureau of Economic Research, which officially dates recessions but typically announces them 7 to 15 months after they begin, meaning by the time NBER told you the December 2007 recession had started, it was already December 2008 and the recession was a year old. The answer to why this pattern hid in plain sight for so long reveals something uncomfortable about how economic expertise actually works. Economists focused on unemployment levels rather than rates of change. Looking for thresholds like unemployment above 6% signals trouble instead of tracking dynamic patterns, which meant the conversation was always about where unemployment stood and not how fast it was moving. Academic prestige favored complexity in a way that made simple observations look unsophisticated. Publishing a regression analysis with 15 variables and sophisticated statistical techniques earned you journal space and tenure, while pointing out that a 0.5 percentage point increase mattered made you look simple, not sophisticated enough for serious academic work. Monetary policy dominated economic thinking from the 1980s through the 2000s, creating a belief that the Federal Reserve could manage business cycles through interest rate adjustments alone. Automatic fiscal stabilizers, which meant government spending that kicks in automatically during downturns, received less attention because everyone assumed the Fed could just cut rates. That confidence lasted until the Great Recession, when interest rates hit 0 and the Fed ran out of room to cut, which suddenly made fiscal policy matter again. The pattern itself was noticed by people who should have acted on it. Ben Bernanke in March 2007, 9 months before the recession started, observed that every 0.5 percentage point rise in unemployment was followed by recession, and then nothing happened with that observation beyond it staying in the meeting transcript. Edward McKelvey came closest to formalizing it before Sahm did. McKelvey, a senior economist at Goldman Sachs, documented a similar indicator in the Wall Street Journal in January 2008, just as the Great Recession was beginning, using a lower threshold of 0.3 percentage points, which produced faster signals but more false positives. The concept existed and had institutional backing from a major Wall Street firm, but it lacked the systematic documentation that would turn it into a widely adopted tool. Walking through what this pattern looks like across 75 years of American economic history shows that the details matter because each recession had its own character and its own causes, but the unemployment signal showed up every single time. The 1953 to 54 recession lasted 10 months with GDP falling 2.6%. While unemployment peaked at 6.1% in September 54 after starting at 2.5% before the downturn, a result of post-Korean War demobilization when government spending collapsed and factories that had been running overtime suddenly weren't. 1957 to 58 was sharper, lasting 8 months with GDP down 3.7% and unemployment hitting 7.5%. The Federal Reserve had been fighting inflation, which meant housing construction had been declining for 18 to 24 months before the recession officially started, putting the warning signs right there in the data. April 1960 to February 61 gets interesting because Arthur Burns, who had been chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, warned Vice President Nixon in February 1960 that recession was coming and urged fiscal expansion. Nixon tried to get the Eisenhower administration to act but failed. The recession happened anyway, and Nixon later blamed his loss to Kennedy on this as Kennedy campaigned on getting America moving again, while unemployment hit 7.1% by May 61. December 1969 to November 1970 followed the standard boom-bust cycle, with the Fed tightening to fight inflation and unemployment hitting 6.1%. But then November 1973 to March 1975 changed everything, lasting 16 months with GDP falling 3.2% and unemployment hitting 9% by May 75, numbers not seen since the Great Depression. The oil shock created stagflation, the moment when unemployment and inflation rose together and broke every economic model economists had, with the unemployment rate jumping from 4.8% before the recession started. Arthur Okun invented the misery index, which added unemployment plus inflation, because traditional measures couldn't capture how bad things felt, and the Federal Reserve initially cut rates to spur growth, which made inflation worse as they flew blind through uncharted territory. The 1980s brought 2 recessions in quick succession, with January to July 1980 lasting 6 months as GDP fell 2.2% and unemployment reached 7.8%. Paul Volcker had announced his new inflation-fighting policy in October 1979, slamming on the brakes, and the recession followed 3 months later as a direct result. July 1981 to November 82 was worse, lasting 16 months with GDP down 2.7% and unemployment hitting 10.8% in November 82, the highest rate since the Great Depression. Volcker had to break inflation's back, and he did, but the cost was enormous and visible in every unemployment office across America. The 1990 to 91 recession was milder, running 8 months with GDP down 1.4% and unemployment peaking at 7.8% in June 92. The savings and loan crisis had been sending signals 12 to 18 months beforehand, but again, those signals were ignored until the damage was done and the recession was underway. March to November 2001 was unusual because it lasted just 8 months and GDP barely contracted at only 0.3%. Yet NBER classified it as a recession based on employment and industrial production declines. This matters because the popular 2 consecutive quarters of negative GDP rule doesn't match how recessions are officially defined, and unemployment hit 6.3% by June 2003 after the Nasdaq had crashed 12 months before and the yield curve had inverted, putting the warnings right there in plain sight. December 2007 to June 2009 was the Great Recession, lasting 18 months with GDP falling 4.3% and unemployment hitting 10% by October 2009. A case study we'll examine in detail because it offers the clearest example of ignored unemployment signals. February to April 2020 brought the COVID recession, lasting just 2 months with GDP collapsing 19.2% in the second quarter and unemployment spiking to 14.7% in April. But this was different as an exogenous shock rather than the usual pattern of weakening demand feeding on itself. To understand how dramatic the Great Depression was by comparison, unemployment hit 24.9% by 1933 and stayed above 14% from 1931 through 1940, a catastrophic experience that shaped every post-war economic policy and explains why these unemployment signals matter so much. The 2007 to 2009 recession offers the clearest example of an unemployment signal that was there, was visible, and was ignored by the people who should have known better. Unemployment bottomed at 4.4% in May 2007, rose to 4.6% by June and 4.7% by September, then hit 5.0% in December 2007 when the recession officially began, a rise of 0.6 percentage points that would have triggered the Sahm Rule months before the worst of the crisis. The labor market was already weakening for 7 months before Lehman Brothers collapsed, with initial jobless claims rising and unemployment reaching 6% by August 2008, while policymakers were still debating whether the economy faced a soft landing or a recession. May 2007 had marked the cyclical low at 4.4%, March 2008 when Bear Stearns collapsed saw 5.1%, and September 2008 when Lehman Brothers filed for bankruptcy brought 6.1%, which means the financial crisis that dominates our memory of this period happened after the labor market had already been deteriorating for over a year. Housing construction employment had peaked in early 2006, providing an 18-month advance warning that was largely dismissed by analysts who thought this time was different. Sheila Bair, who was FDIC chair at the time, later stated she saw warning signs in 2006 about unaffordable mortgages, but her concerns were not heeded, and the yield curve had inverted in 2006 only to be waved away by experts insisting the old patterns no longer applied. This is the pattern across every recession. The signals appear, experts notice them, and then institutional inertia or confirmation bias or just plain hoping for the best means nothing changes until it's too late. Claudia Sahm formalized the rule in May 2019 as part of a Brookings Institution book called Recession Ready. But what makes her story different from the typical economist discovers pattern narrative is that she wasn't trying to predict recessions at all. Her own words make this clear. "I created the Sahm Rule to send out stimulus checks automatically. The idea was to act fast to make the recession less severe and help families, and the star was always the stimulus check, not the indicator that other people named after me." Working at the Federal Reserve and serving at the Council of Economic Advisors during the Obama administration had shown her firsthand how slowly policy responds to downturns, with debates and delays and political paralysis, meaning that by the time Congress passes stimulus legislation, the recession might be half over. Automatic stabilizers solve this because when the indicator triggers, payments go out immediately without requiring congressional action. The intellectual environment in 2019 was ready for this idea in a way it hadn't been before, because the Great Recession had demonstrated that monetary policy faced limits at zero interest rates, and fiscal policy mattered more than the previous 2 decades had acknowledged. The case for automatic triggers was stronger than it had been since the 1970s, creating an opening for Sahm's proposal. The St. Louis Federal Reserve added the Sahm Rule to its FRED database in October 2019, and within months it would be tested as the COVID recession hit in February 2020. The rule triggered at a reading of 4.002 months after the recession started, keeping the perfect track record intact until the test case that would reveal the rule's limits arrived 4 years later. July 2024 brought the Sahm Rule trigger at 0.53 as unemployment reached 4.3%, which sent news outlets running headlines and analysts debating whether recession was imminent while markets reacted to what seemed like a clear warning. But no recession followed, and by September 2025, the indicator had retreated to 0.23, while GDP growth remained around 2.8% through the trigger period, breaking the perfect record that had lasted 7 decades. Sahm herself had warned this could happen because the post-pandemic economy featured unusual dynamics where immigration was expanding the labor force and workers who had left during COVID were returning. The unemployment increase reflected labor supply expansion rather than collapsing demand, which meant the usual self-reinforcing spiral wasn't happening, and as she wrote in August 2024, "We are not in a recession now, contrary to the historical signal from the Sahm Rule, but the momentum is in that direction." Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell characterized the rule as a statistical regularity rather than an economic rule, adding that it's not telling you something must happen, while Chicago Fed President Austin Goolsbee noted the situation was ahistorical because gradual unemployment increases without obvious demand. Weakness didn't fit prior patterns. The difference between a pattern and a law explains what happened. The Sahm Rule worked for 70 years because recessions follow self-reinforcing dynamics where people lose jobs, they stop spending, businesses cut more jobs, and the cycle accelerates until the 0.5 threshold represents roughly the point where this dynamic becomes unstoppable without policy intervention. But when unemployment rises because more people are entering the labor force, when supply expands rather than demand collapses, that dynamic doesn't apply and the pattern breaks because the underlying mechanism changed. Sahm has acknowledged the frustration. "I created a monster. The Sahm Rule is a historical pattern, not a law of nature," she said, pointing to the gap between identifying reliable signals and treating them as certainties as where the trouble starts. The 2024 false positive accelerated research into improved versions of the unemployment signal, and two refinements stand out for their potential to filter out the noise that tripped up the original rule. John Otrakoon from the Richmond Fed and Adam Scavett from the Philadelphia Fed published the SOS indicator in February 2025, which uses the insured unemployment rate from weekly claims data instead of the monthly household survey unemployment rate, and sets the threshold at 0.2 percentage points. Weekly frequency instead of monthly enables faster detection. The indicator has had 0 false positives since 1971 compared to the Sahm Rule's 2 to 4, depending on how you classify the pre-1970 episodes, and it's not subject to the household survey sampling biases that have gotten worse as response rates decline. The SOS indicator identified all 7 recessions since 1971, giving it a perfect track record over more than 5 decades. Pascal Michaya and Emmanuel Saez developed what's called the Miches Rule in 2024, combining unemployment rate changes with job vacancy data and taking the minimum of unemployment and vacancy indicators to eliminate false positives caused by supply-driven unemployment increases. When unemployment rises but vacancies remain elevated, the economy is absorbing new workers rather than shedding existing ones, which is exactly the dynamic that tripped the Sahm Rule in 2024. The Miches Rule detects recessions with an average delay of just 1.2 months compared to Sahm's 2.7 months, and it works back to 1929 with 0 false positives across 15 recessions. These improvements validate Sahm's core insight that simple indicators based on unemployment dynamics work because recessions involve self-reinforcing employment dynamics, while the refinements add filters and use better data sources but keep the fundamental signal unchanged. Economists spent decades building sophisticated multivariable models to predict recessions and failed repeatedly, while a single data series with one threshold worked perfectly for 70 years, which tells us something about how complex systems actually behave. Recessions follow feedback loops where job losses reduced spending causes more job losses, and once this loop starts, it accelerates until the 0.5 percentage point threshold represents roughly where the dynamic becomes self-sustaining. Complex models try to capture everything: consumer confidence, manufacturing indices, housing starts, credit spreads, yield curves, adding variables until the model fits historical data. But more variables mean more ways to be wrong, and when the next recession happens for new reasons like a pandemic or a financial crisis or an oil shock, the model trained on past patterns fails because it's optimized for the last war, not the next one. Simple indicators succeed by measuring the outcome directly, asking whether unemployment is accelerating rather than trying to predict what will cause acceleration. The self-reinforcing dynamic looks the same whether it started with housing or tech stocks or banking, which means you don't need to know the trigger to recognize that the feedback loop has begun. The Sahm Rule triggers during recessions rather than before them, which is different from the yield curve that inverts 6 to 24 months ahead of recessions because it captures expectations about future monetary policy. The Sahm Rule confirms that the economy has crossed a threshold and that the feedback loop is active and accelerating, making it a different type of signal that serves a different purpose. Optimal policy would combine both signals by using yield curve inversion as advance warning to prepare and using unemployment triggers as confirmation that automatic fiscal stabilizers should activate. But that requires accepting that simple sometimes beats sophisticated, and institutions struggle with that acknowledgement. Sahm's original proposal for automatic stimulus payments triggered by her indicator remains unimplemented by Congress, even though the rule has become famous, appears in the FRED database, gets discussed in Federal Reserve meetings, and is analyzed by Wall Street strategists. The policy application she designed it for hasn't happened, which means the gap between identifying reliable signals and acting on them remains as wide as ever. The National Bureau of Economic Research takes 7 to 15 months on average to announce that a recession began, with the shortest lag being 4 months for the February 2020 peak announced in June 2020, and the longest being 21 months for the March 91 trough announced in December 92. By the time official recession dating arrives, it's often too late for the information to be useful, and typical recessions require months of conflicting data interpretation, while the COVID recession was announced unusually quickly because the depth and diffusion were unmistakable. Real-time indicators matter because of this lag, and the story of the Sahm Rule is frustrating because the pattern was there in the data for 7 decades, while economists observed it informally, but transforming observation into action required someone to formalize it, advocate for it, and then watch as the policy implication of automatic stabilizers got praised but not implemented. The unemployment pattern that predicted every recession since 1950 wasn't hiding in some obscure corner, but sitting in the most watched economic statistic in America. Published monthly and analyzed obsessively. The data screamed the signal, but we just weren't listening, or more accurately, we were listening but not acting as Ben Bernanke noticed it in March 2007. Edward McKelvey documented it in January 2008, and Claudia Sahm formalized it in May 2019 after 70 years of perfect signals. The 2024 false positive doesn't invalidate the insight but clarifies it, showing that the pattern worked because recessions follow self-reinforcing dynamics where job losses cause spending cuts that cause more job losses. When unemployment rises for different reasons like labor supply expansion, that dynamic doesn't apply. Which is why the refinements being developed now add filters to distinguish demand-driven unemployment from supply-driven unemployment while keeping the core signal intact. Sometimes the simplest measures work best not despite their simplicity, but because of it. And complex systems often have simple signatures if you're willing to believe that a 0.5 percentage point threshold captures something real about how economic downturns unfold. The pattern predicted every recession for 70 years, and whether it predicts the next one depends on whether the next recession looks like the last 11 or like something new. The story of how this signal went overlooked for so long tells us about expertise, about institutional inertia, and about the gap between knowing and acting. The indicator exists now, formalized and tracked and discussed, but whether anyone actually uses it to trigger the automatic stabilizers Sahm envisioned remains to be seen, and that gap between the signal and the response might be the most overlooked pattern of all.